Good afternoon. I was very worried that you also might get knocked off of our usual meeting place. You know, the Collaborate Ultra. I had a class this morning and somebody decided to knock me off of there. I think it's the technicians trying to do stuff, trying to give it a new look. And so they knocked me off. The students did not connect with me, so I had to record it. I created a different Collaborate Ultra and decided to connect with them that way. Of course, they were waiting to meet with me on a different one. You know what I'm talking about. Perhaps some of you are more sophisticated than I am on this. In any case, I recorded it for them. They didn't find me. Later this morning, I learned. So I'm going to have to transfer that to the usual format or redo the lecture again, which is fine. It'll be a review. But I was worried that you guys would be knocked off too, except when I opened this up today or right now. We were at the usual place. Technology, you die by it. And just like the United States, you know, this is a little aside to start our day. You know, we can send people to the moon and we can create so many sophisticated kinds of weapons and do incredibly things that no other people can do on Earth. But we cannot run elections very well. It's just the most fascinating thing about the United States that every year, every 4 years or whatever, we just don't seem to be able to run elections very well. All right, externalities in sports. That's what we talked about last time. I didn't finish it, obviously. I promised that we'll develop a model. I'll help you develop a model. Some of you are writing your term paper on this one. Just as a review for all of us, for the benefit of everybody, and reconnect. We talked about benefits and or externalities in sports. Okay, there are positive externalities. We talked about them. Negative externalities, we identified what those are and gave examples of positive externalities and negative externalities in detail. And that's what we did in the last class. Today, I will continue on that. And before we finish the session, I will make sure that we have a model, an assessment model that you could use that could be helpful to you. So to make sure that your value added for the day and for the course is significantly better than any other course that you have taken in economics, I will begin by mentioning where is the source of this externalities? What is the literature? What is the literature on it? And where did we get the idea of evaluating, assessing externalities? A very difficult thing to do. All right. Well, I'll take you to classical economists first, okay? Very quickly. Classical economists, as you know, are people who had the great ideas in economics, and none of them have been really been refuted. And so we continue as economists, today's economists, continue to push those ideas as well, because the foundation of classical economics, although some adjustments has been made, is foundationally very, very good. How many of you know that there are three great laws of economics? In fact, they're called the Trinity. Those of you who are thinking of going to graduate school or majoring in econ, at least should hear from me. You won't hear it in any other class, I promise you. There are three great laws of economics. One of them is the law of demand and supply, right? Law of demand and supply. I think most of you know what that means. You've heard of it in a different way, but it is one of the greatest laws of economics. In this case, we say price, classical economists said price is a function of quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Look at what is on the right side and look at what is on the left side, all right, of the equality sign. Right? Price determined in the marketplace is a function of quantity demanded and quantity supplied. That's what it says. That's one of the greatest laws of economics, according to classical economists. And two, I think you may not have heard of this one, the law of cost of production. It's called the law of the cost of production. I'm going through this because my model includes such things, such language. And if you cannot understand the language, and if I cannot communicate with you using the same language, then you and I will be on different planets. And so I need to clear that ahead of time. So the law of the cost of production. The law of the cost of production, according to classical economists, says cost of production determines the value of anything. I think most of you will agree to this. The cost of production determines value. And what classical economists thought was value, okay? Value is really the same thing as price, okay? Morgan is not going to pay $25 for the bucket of corn, bushel of corn, if she didn't attach a $25 value to it. And hence, price and value are viewed in the same way. And so classical economists has held that what we call the law of the cost of production is that the cost of production determines value. All right? The cost of production. The basis of value is the cost of production, what it took to produce an item. Let me go to number 3. I just ran out of board here very quickly. The third is the law of distribution. You see, the law of distribution. I am not disciplined enough to write on a board like this. And so I ran out of space very quickly. My apologies for those kinds of things. And so here you are, the law of the law of distribution. These are important laws. I'm not going to go too much into the law of distribution. It specifically says that no, distribution has its own laws, and the distribution of both goods and services and income and so on and so forth is an important component, of course, of what we call the marketplace as well. Now, I want you to remember these 3 laws. None of these are really independent of others, okay? Of the other, I should say. None is, the law of demand is not independent of the law of distribution and the law of cost of production and so on and so forth, vice versa. All right. Now, having said this, then we can specify in a mathematical way. They specified in a mathematical way what each looks like. I wrote the law of demand. In the case of law of demand, we saw that price is a function of quantity supplied and quantity demanded. All right. That was what we said. In the case of the law of cost of production, you can write this way. All right. Quantity is a function of price. Remember, price, value, right? All right. So you can see where we're going with this. And the third part, of course, says the law of distribution says a little more complicated. The classical doctrine, the classical economists said the doctrine itself includes wages, you see, interest, okay, and rent, what is called rent. These things are how the wealth of the wealth created in an economy gets distributed. That's what the law of distribution. In a marketplace, wages are determined by the supply and labor of demand. Interest is determined by the supply and demand of capital, or capital. All right, that is what you called in your principles class, I hope in the past, the loanable funds market. The supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds determines interest, right? And interest is the payment to capital. Wages are the payment to labor. And rent, as you well know, is, of course, the payment to any scarce resource that is in limited supply, which, like, for example, land. All right, land is in limited supply. And classical economists explain this much, much, much more in a sophisticated and in an involved way. All right, I can go into that. It's not necessary, it's not germane to talk about the, for example, how do we define rent? All right, let me just give us an example here so that I don't belabor the issue. Here, rent, I will write in red, they say is the total value, okay? Rent is total value minus, okay, wages, interest, and profit. Okay, that's what they said. Classical economists looked at things that way. In other words, you have total value, you have to subtract from their wages, interest, and profit. The profit is what goes to the entrepreneur. In those days, they called them the capitalists. All right, entrepreneur. That's what rent is. And you can define now, any one of you can define now what you might call in this law of distribution. What is profit then? Well, to profit now, you can use the equation A here, or relationship A, to write B and to write C. Profit then becomes total value minus rent, wages, and interest. You see that? You just replace one of the variables in the right, on the right side. What about wages? All right. And wages now become total value minus rent, interest, and profit. Okay. So now I have established the relationship for you. That's how classical economists define things. Some people today may disagree with that, and obviously that is okay, and that is fine. But nonetheless, that is the conception they had about where value it was, and how then you go from these three laws and incorporate externalities. To do that, two of the most important people who have written about this before it became something of a celebrity, as it were, are two individuals. One is a person by the name is A.C. Pigou. Okay. The second one is, you may have heard of the second person, is Ronald Coase. I'm sure you've heard of the Coase theory, okay, or theorem. All right. A.C. Pigou and Ronald Coase. For those of you who have heard the name of Keynes, Pigou was the teacher of Keynes in their days, as it were. All right. So how do we deal with the externalities according to these two individuals? They acknowledge that there is positive as well as negative externalities. And so what is the basis then of today's evaluation and measurement and assessment of externality? It goes back to what these two people did. Changing colors here so that you can follow this lecture. A.C. Pagoo, for example, looked at taxes and subsidies. All right. Taxes have an external diseconomy. Subsidies also will have external diseconomy, okay, depending of whether taxes are high or low. All right. Higher tax would have external diseconomy. Lower tax would have external economy, positive, negative, right? The same thing with subsidies. And his theory then about externalities is based on that. How about Mr. Coase of University of Chicago, by the way? Mr. Coase looked at issues from an economic agent point of view. All right. He said, in effect, I will present it briefly, and I will discuss it in just a little bit here. He suggested that economic agents, economic actors, could work out details about externalities if they are left alone. No, notice to this description. Economic agents, economic actors would work out the details of positive and negative externalities if they are left alone. In other words, without the intervention of government, without an intervention of a third party. This has come to be known, I am simplifying now, all right? This has come to be known as Coase theorem. Coase theorem is so powerful, and he stated his theorem in 1960 in the Journal of the Law, in the Journal of Law and Economics, by suggesting that if people are left alone, any positive or negative externalities could be worked out without the government assigning the ownership. Assigning ownership means assigning who is at fault and who is not at fault. All right, that's what he meant. Pagoo obviously looked at, by the way, his work is called The Economics of Welfare. That's what it was called. All right. And he was the first environmental policy writer, if you will, among economists. And he started out by advocating for pollution charges. Okay. Charge those producers of goods and services who pollute, he says. And he has become very popular today because there's so much externality being generated. Okay. Mr. Coase gave the example of what was known as the confectioner and the doctor example in 1960. The confectioner is the guy who is producing goods and services next door to a doctor's office. In the production of these goods and services, the confectioner creates sound, creates all kinds of externalities, noises that are disturbing, noises that are uncomfortable, okay, when he cuts, when he bakes, whatever he's doing in there. And if the affected individual next door is the doctor who is taking care of his patients and he wants to listen to his patients and want to have a private time and so forth with them, if the doctor believes that the confectioner is causing too much noise and too much problem to affect his practice next door, then without the government intervening between these two agents, these economic agents, the two can settle the issue by negotiating, as it were, by talking to one another, work the details out. And in that example, Coase suggests, who doesn't like the noise more? Is it the confectioner or the doctor? If it is the doctor, then the doctor ought to pay. You see that now? The doctor ought to pay the confectioner to reduce the noise. He says both of them benefit. The confectioner gets something, the doctor gets something. Both of them benefit. Government does not have to interfere to assign property rights. You've heard that term, property rights. In this case, does the confectioner have the property rights, the right to pollute the air, to make the noise that the doctor is so opposed to? You see, that's the assignment issue, the assignment of who owns the property right to pollute, in this case, through noise. And so he said, when the parties affected by externalities can negotiate costlessly, without any cost, right, with one another, obviously, he says an efficient outcome results no matter how the law assigns responsibilities for the damages. You don't need the law in this case. Regardless of what the law does, particularly if they are left alone, these two individuals can negotiate costlessly with one another. They don't have to incur additional costs because it's in the benefit of both of them. What he's doing is really creating incentive for the two individuals to negotiate among them. And so, by the way, Coase theorem, it's called theorem. It's a famous theorem. It's famous because my oldest son went to Harvard Law School. And one day he was a political science major underground and decided to go to law school. And one day he called and he says, oh, you know, we're talking about Coase theorem. And of course, we had a very good discussion on the issue at that time. And I kept on asking him, how did this come up, et cetera, so that I can have more conversation about the issue with him. And I learned through that process, not only at Harvard and other places, Yale and all other places, including the University of Chicago, law school students are being trained using Coase theorem to settle issues. You see, lawyers being trained to settle issues without going to court. That's the new, actually it's not been new, for the last 30 years or so. You may have heard or you may have known that most things are settled. Somebody goes to court and all of a sudden things are settled. Coase theorem in effect. All right. So in summary then, the concept is this for Coase theorem, and I'm going to Coase rather than dwelling on Pigou. Those who create harmful externalities, therefore, do not pay for the damages done to others, that they have little incentive to do so. So the market, he says, creates these kinds of goods in abundance. So when there are negative externalities, you have abundant goods and services produced in that category. Sports. Is it a harmful externality or beneficial externality? And that explains why we have this good called sports entertainment in abundance in some cases. All right. But the concept, the Coase theorem says two things happen in a situation where you have externalities, both negative and positive. One, those who create harmful externalities do not pay for the damages done to others because they have very little incentive. So what happens in the marketplace? The market creates these goods in abundance. If a steel producer is not charged for producing pollution, you have abundant steel being produced because there's no control. The opposite side of that is the following. Those who create beneficial externalities are not compensated for doing so. So they have little incentive to supply these in large quantities. The point I wish to make in summary is that when you have harmful externalities, the good is being produced, too much of the good is being produced. When you have beneficial externalities, too little of the good is produced. So what should government do then in that case? What should economic regulators, economic managers do? What should be done? Where you have harmful externalities, you try to reduce them. In other words, give incentive to those not to create these harmful externalities. And harmful externalities in the case of the production of steel is to produce less steel or to install equipment. Remember, just notice what I just said. Install equipment at a cost, obviously, you see, to reduce the pollution. In a case where there is beneficial externality, produce more of the good. More of the good. All right. Somebody has given you in Economics 2801 the example of the bees and the orchard and so on and so forth. All right. For you, you need to know externalities, and I hope you understand externalities in the sense that I presented them out here to you. Last week, we talked about the crowding out effect of externalities that the externalities bring about in communities, okay? The debt which ensues for those areas hosting the event, etc., 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 etc. And I enumerated quite a few of these examples. And then we said there is a spatial related to space, SPATIL, spatial separation between rich and poor, engendered by major urban redevelopment operations and so on and so forth. Those are externalities. So given this discussion, then now you understand what the basis of externalities are and what the basis of the remedy for externalities is. All right. So I just reviewed a little bit of the literature, and what I wish to provide to you now is a little bit of a model. All right, a model of assessment for the, let's say, the things that you and I both understand a little bit about, the environment, let's say. All right, so let's sketch things out. By the way, you can interrupt me at any point in our discussion, my friends, at any point. Let's say we wish to have a monetary, I will write out here, just sometimes I may be quiet. I'm still here with you. A monetary evaluation. That's what we're trying to develop. Of, let's call it damages or profits. That's the model we wish to develop. So let me put a box here. That's what we wish to do. All right. And how is it that we're going to do that? One way of trying to develop a monetary evaluation of damages or benefits, profits I put here, is to look at, in the first place, let's see, substitution markets. substitution markets, create a substitution market, as it were, or a hypothetical market. These are not easy to do, but I'm just building a model for you here. A hypothetical market, or in the third part here, the third part there, an indirect market. I'll explain. An indirect market. All three are different. A substitution market implies that you find something similar that is a substitute and try to evaluate the monetary damages or profit based on that substitution market. A hypothetical market implies that you can have a direct method. You can ask individuals their preference. That's why it's called hypothetical market. Their preference for something. You can attach or use a questionnaire, or you can use survey. All right. But you create a hypothetical situation and ask for information. That's what I mean. That's what we mean by hypothetical market. And the indirect market would be physical or other damages, okay, that the monetary evaluation by some other means, indirect method, indirect market. So what is the indirect market for X? Well, it may be Y, it may be X1 instead of just X. So you use that to create value. But each one of these have subcategories that I can use to explain, and I will. So what is a substitution market? One group is known as protection expenses. Okay, protection expenses. You can use protection expenses as a form of substitution market. Oops, I think I'm going to mess up here very quickly. There is a second here. I'm going to put it down right there. And that will be what are known as hedonist prices. Okay. As a substitution market, what people are willing to pay. What is a hedonist price? Here is an example of a hedonist price. In a hedonist market, or quality goes down, you pay less. Quality is up, you pay more, right? In other words, characteristics of the good changes the price people are willing to pay for it. That's what a hedonist market is. All right. So use hedonist prices to arrive at substitution market, or what is known as travel cost as substitution market as well. Okay, these three can be used under substitution market. Now, what is a travel cost as a substitution market used as a substitute for something? Well, in this case, you travel more or spend more to travel, and that is an expression of the value of the site visited, for example. Does that make sense? Right? That's a substitute market. Okay? So you travel more, or spend more or less, or travel more or less, and that is an expression of the value of the site that you're likely to visit. So if you visit more often, there is a value attached to that space, to that place you're visiting. You see, because we're trying to find a substitution market. Where you cannot find a direct market, you find substitute. And so you've spent a lot traveling to this place. That is indicative of the value you attach to this place, place X, etc. All right. What about a hypothetical market? Sometimes hypothetical markets are known as contingent evaluation markets, okay? Contingent markets. Now, what is the meaning of contingent market? Well, or I should say contingent or contingent evaluation, I should say here. I missed something here. Contingent evaluation. Or what this means is you can have direct evaluation method. You can use direct evaluation method, or you ask individuals their preference through questionnaires, all right, or through surveys, and how much they're willing to pay for it. That's what's called contingent evaluation. And that comes under hypothetical. It's a hypothetically, how much are you willing to pay for this? That's a contingent evaluation system of trying to correct, trying to evaluate using monetary methods damages or benefits that arise from something. Some of you might say, this is highly esoteric, but unless you understand examples of this, it'll be very difficult for you to understand the concept of externality, you see. And so an understanding of a little bit of this esoteric stuff is going to be extremely beneficial. I know it is beneficial to you. Okay, so hypothetical market can be contingent evaluation. I gave you examples of direct method. You ask individuals their preference through questionnaire or surveys, okay? And how much they're willing to pay for stuff. It's contingent, it's hypothetical. That's one way of finding data for stuff. Indirect markets include physical damages that are monetized. All right, let me write it here. Physical damages that are monetized. If somebody comes and you're walking and runs you over with a bicycle, you can assess the physical damage and you can monetize it. What does this mean? This means a monetary evaluation by an economist or some agency, some agent of the damages done, for example, to the environment. And if somebody, ran into you with a bicycle, the monetary damages done to your legs, as it were. Okay, indirect is the physical damages that are monetized. You can use a model of this sort to conclude and to assess and to evaluate damages or advantages or profits that are caused as a result of a particular externality. Will this apply to a production of goods and services? This one does not directly apply to production of goods and services. If you have production of goods and services, you have data. You have what it will cost. You have how much it costs to produce. You have market values that are given to you. You know what a car is worth, right? In the case of goods and services, all right? If somebody damages your car, you know the value of that car. And so the only thing left now is what happened to you when you do not have that car. All right? What expenses do you incur? Insurance companies, when you do not have the car, they say, well, we'll let you go into a hotel. or we will fix that and then fix this. So markets like this are generally established. But pollution is a very difficult thing. And the externalities are the consequence of having a sports function, for example, become a little bit tricky to evaluate. And so some of you, those of you, I should say, that are uh, beginning to write papers in evaluating externalities might want to include a little bit of the framework here. Okay, uh, you may not be writing an original paper, but you need to be able to understand, uh, number one, what basis for evaluation externalities is. And for sports, I gave you what the points were, right? Negative externality. No, let me begin with the positive externalities. I think we talked about improved health, right? Of, of sports in general. And how do you evaluate improved health? You can either use hypothetical market value or indirect market value or substitution market value. You see the point now? Okay. Lengthened lifespan. Uh, well, lengthened lifespan, the value of that is, well, if you're earning so much, let's say, and your lifespan is lengthened, and you're likely to be earning a percentage of that down the road, right? In that case, you have direct evaluation, direct method. Okay. We also said reduced absenteeism, social integration. You can give you can measure social integration, the benefits of social integration. I'm not saying you should, you as a class, as an individual, but people can measure social integration through the contingent evaluation method, the hypothetical market method, by applying and creating surveys, right? Reduce forms of social pathology, stealing and drugs, etc., etc., right? Hooliganism, right? Those kinds of things. Then the negative externalities, we talk the damage caused to sensitive natural environment. This kind of model becomes more appropriate because it's very difficult to assess the damages or positive things caused by environmental improvement or degradation. How much value and how much value can you put on the improvement of the fauna of your neighborhood, of the forests? You have to have a model of this kind, a hypothetical market. You can ask, that's what the Sierra Club does, isn't it? The Sierra Club, that I was a member for many years, and they do good job. What the Sierra Club does is it administers surveys every now and then, okay, every once in a while, and they follow the value of that survey. They create hypothetical market contingent evaluation, the damage to wetlands and dunes and so forth, certain consequences of intensive sporting activity like doping. I think those could be measured directly, can't they? Or indirect market. Okay. In the case of doping accidents and illnesses, you can use the physical damage. You can monetize that. Now you can see how the model is connected to these externalities, both and positive and negative. Nuisance, for example, linked to sports goods industries, pollution. All right, you could do that. You can also apply the substitution market, the travel costs, protection expenses, and so on and so forth, as proxy, you see, as proxy A proxy is something you put in place of another. So claiming that one does not have enough data sometimes doesn't become uh, an acceptable excuse in every instance. You can create data if you look at it very carefully and understand other methods, market evaluation, monetary evaluation of damages, as I am proposing here in our discussion. All right. So you can always use another variable. In place of y, you can use x. In place of I, you can use j. But your responsibility becomes then to justify why you use why you use j in place of I, why you used y in place of x. And this model gives you that authority, as it were. And I am connecting this model to what, in my discussion at least, what Pigou and Coase have done in the past to evaluate the consequences of externalities. Okay. By the way, in case you want to check it out, the Journal of Law and Economics, 1960, that's volume 3, I think. Yeah, volume 3, 1960. The title of the paper is it's a tiny looking little paper that didn't have any equations in it, but so significant because Mr. Coase is also a lawyer as well as an economist. The title of the paper is The Problem of Social Cost. Okay. Does nuisance create social cost? Yes. Do nuisances link to major sports and infrastructure or activities? Yes. Okay. There's are there nuisances created by doping, accidents, and illnesses? Of course. Okay. There are certain kinds of nuisances created. So it's in that sense, and with that in mind, that I decided that I want to have a little discussion and a presentation on a model of monetary evaluation of damages and profits. For those of you who may be interested, I can give further details on the model. But let me open it up for questions and answer at this point. I will stop recording.